Real talk for real people, right here in the Inland Empire. We are 1050 AM, KCAA.
Everybody needs a human touch. Everybody needs love.
Now, from the studios of KCAA AM 1050, downtown San Bernardino, it's live Weekend Talk Radio. A talk show about everything for absolutely everybody. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the many moods of Vince Daniels.
Absolutely everybody, everybody, everybody. Absolutely everybody in the whole wide world. Everybody breathes and everybody needs. Absolutely everybody. Absolutely everybody. Absolutely everybody. Oh yeah. Absolutely everybody. Everybody. Absolutely everybody.
Absolutely, a show for everybody with kids who cares about their kids. Joined today by my co-host, Cal Walton, and our special guest, Charlotte Thomson Iserbyt, former senior policy advisor of the U.S. Department of Education and author of The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America.
Yes.
And it is deliberate, isn't it, Cal?
Absolutely. There's no doubt, and it's something that's been happening for I guess a good 30 years. I know Charlotte's done a lot more research, and she has more experience than we do, so she can tell us a lot more about that.
I think the kids, not just the kids today, it's like their parents. I think, I'm thinking this is a lost cause.
I certainly hope not. I think that with some of the uprisings that you see taking place in America, whether it's Tea Party activists or Occupy Wall Street, I think that you're starting to see people who are becoming concerned about what's happening in society, and they're taken to the streets, and regardless of our political affiliations and belief systems, I know that we each have our own, it's just important that people are actually taken to the streets and demonstrating concern over what we see happening. Charlotte, now, before the break, you were talking about some of the assignments and work that your son brought home that really made you start wondering about what was happening in
the tipping point.
What was the tipping point? What was happening in schools? Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, that really wasn't. I suppose that was important. That's what got me looking at things. I wasn't yet convinced that anything was major or was really wrong, but I did get into the elementary school curriculum. The social studies textbook was World of Mankind. And this was for third graders. And I subsequently learned in my office in the Department of Education that this was a very, very important new textbook for global education that came out in the early 70s. And in 1981, they were referring to it. So our district obviously was a pilot for change that we had it that early on. But it had the teacher taking the little students through town, like a small town. I lived in Camden, Maine, on the ocean, a beautiful town, and asking these little first graders to identify the big and small houses. You'd have a big captain's house on the left and a trailer or a mobile home on the right, because we didn't have zoning then. Mm-hmm. And then she'd say, what do you think they eat in the captain's house? And they'd say, oh, steak, and then they'd say, what do you think they eat in the trailer? Well, they eat pizza, Mm-hmm. And I thought, what are they doing, And I thought, this is really very strange. And so I went to the school board about it. I went to a school board meeting, and I said, the only words that, because I'd lived abroad, I'd lived in communist countries and socialist countries, and I said, the only label I can put on this is class warfare. And, oh boy, the next day I found out from a tenant living in our house that word was out that I was a kook. The superintendent was terrified. He knew I was onto him. And yes, that was exactly it was class warfare. And from that time on, then I really started watching everything. And then, of course, I ended up going to the training to become a change agent, and I found out, how to identify the good parents who know that all those programs are are really no good for their children, and none of their business, the schools getting into all that stuff. They want them to learn to read and write, and also how to identify the important people in the community. We learned how to do that. You know, the Rotary, the Chamber of Commerce, the Garden Club, all those people, good people. They don't know they're being used, right, to put the programs in. And so then, of course, I went on to the Department of Ed after. I formed an organization in the state of Maine, Guardians of Education of Maine. Then I went on to the Department of Ed after. And then what were we going to say? We were talking about the, you asked me, you said you thought it was a corporatist system. Well, basically it is. I mean, if you have, it's also, you could call it corporate fascist, or you could call it a communist system. And the reason I use the word communist is everybody wants to avoid it so. But the plan has been from the beginning, and I have all the documents, to make the United States into a communist country. And it is, and the Reese Committee hearings, the Norman Dodd interview, the head of the Reese Committee hearings was Norman Dodd, and he was a friend of mine. He's passed away a long time ago, wonderful man. And those hearings, the transcript is at my son's website as well. The fellow I bought them from, I paid $3,000 for 3,000 pages. It was the only copy available in the United States since the foundations, the tax-exempt foundations that were being investigated, right? They bought up all the copies that they possibly could get their hands on. They didn't want the American people to know. But there's this one copy left, and I managed to buy it from my friend, and it's up on my son's website. Now, my friend I bought it from was told by one of the foundation minions, we'll pay you anything for that, 20 years ago. We will pay you anything. You name a price. And he said no. And I got it for $3,000, which was nothing. He could have gotten whatever he wanted for it. So it's very important. Now, people say it's corporatism or it's corporate fascism. Well, yeah, it is. But it's mainly communism. And the reason I say that is regional government, which is being put in all over the country right now. You can call it sustainable development. You can call it whatever you want. It is communism. And I have a quote in my book. Write this down, folks. The name of the communist writer for the Daily World in 1970, his name was Zeitlin, Zeitlin. Look in the index to my book, and you will see where he says the United States isn't moving fast enough towards regionalism. It worked so well in the Soviet Union.
Now, one thing I want to challenge you on your use of the terms communism and socialism, and I'll tell you why. Because I think what happens is when you refer to the control that's taking place in our educational system as communism and socialism, what that does is that prevents people from being able to see the corporate connection and the corporate role that these changes are playing. And really, basically what we have now, and from my perspective and from my studies and from my experience, is we really have an educational system that's being adopted, that's really being designed to promote the needs of corporate America. For example, we have educational programs for kids in elementary schools that are about helping them identify what they want to do for a living, and they're in the second and the third grade, and they're at a point where they really, at that point, they should be learning how to read, learning how to do math. So, and just in terms of standardized education, all of this testing, deciding which students get to attend the elite universities, which students are placed on tracks where they're going to be working in the service economy, and frankly, which students are going to be placed on a track that's going to lead them straight to prison and to jail. That's what I'm seeing. So when you use terms like socialism and communism, I think what that does is that keeps people from seeing the role and the connection that this has to what's taking place in corporate America. So just comment on that and challenge me, make me a believer.
The same thing, because the Soviet system identified the children at a very young age for what career they wanted them to be in, too. And they trained them, just like ballet dancers or whatever. Those are like magnet schools. This is for the planned global economy. So it is the same. I mean, you may see it, and people out there have got to understand what I'm saying, and I don't say it. I'm not happy having to tell them that it is communism. And the reason I tell them that is because someday they're going to wake up and say, oh, my goodness, we just thought this was to train our children to get a good job. We thought the corporations and the government were doing this for our... No! With that particular system comes all the controls, comes the shutting down of the free market, which is the planned economy, everything. Now, let me point out, Ronald Reagan, as president, was the one who initiated the merger of the public and private sector. Mm-hmm. He is also the president who signed the agreements with the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, to merge the two education systems. Now, these are, you see, if you look at what you're talking about, and I agree with you, if you look at it without all of this other evidence and history, you see it as a fairly benign. The worst thing you could call it would be corporate fascist, probably. Socialist, probably. But what we're looking at is the entire system, and if you go, as I said, you go on my son's website and you read that one particular book called Conclusions and Recommendations for the Social Studies by Carnegie in 1934, just type conclusions in, your eyes are going to roll on the floor. Because it says right there that this is what they're putting in. It's deliberate. It's going to change our whole way of life. We're going to have to get used to it. And that is what is being put in right now under the school to work, which you were just talking about, apprenticeships, etc., planned economy. Now, when you have a planned economy, there is no freedom there for your children to do what they want, to learn math, science, music, whatever. No, not unless that child has been selected at an early age, and the government will, just like in the Soviet Union or in Cuba, they select them out, and if they're lucky, they might end up being a great violinist. But most of them won't be lucky. And what we're putting in right now is a very elitist system, as is the Soviet system, where you will have, a very narrow percentage up top who will live extremely well and will be using all the robots, the trained robots, for their whatever purposes they have in a world government. Now, the merger of the United States and the Soviet Union is clearly spelled out on a video that Edward Griffin has. Edward Griffin. Type his name into the internet. He's a wonderful researcher, man, terrific historian, writer. He videotaped Norman Dodd, the research director for the Reese Committee hearings. He videotaped it. It was a great conversation. And Norman Dodd spells out very clearly there that when he was sent up to New York to interview the head of the Ford Foundation, Rowan Gaither told him that we do not spend our money. It is not our agenda. We do not make the agenda here at the Ford Foundation. The agenda is determined by the White House. And that was Eisner at the time, and it's still the same, whatever president. That the purpose of the foundations at that time was to use their money to change America so it could be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Now, that is why I insist on using the word communism, regionalism, sustainable development. Then I'll use socialism or corporate fascism. But basically what we're looking at is no religion, the teaching of evolution, the school to work agenda, which is the Soviet one, the use of the method Pavlov or Skinner, and world government, right?
This is all collectivism.
Let me follow up with another question. You're tracing the development of this back to the Reagan years. Okay. Now, so what you're talking about is really antithetical to people's views of how they see Ronald Reagan. People see Ronald Reagan as a conservative. They see him as somebody who's pro-religion, somebody who was anti-abortion, somebody who was small government. And so what you're saying is antithetical to people's beliefs about what they see Ronald Reagan to be. How do you account for that?
How do I account for that? I worked for him. I know. I was dismissed from my job. I wrote him a letter. It's on my website, my letter, Deliberate Dumbing Down. It's a PDF. The letter I wrote him, I told him I was working in a Marxist factory, which was the U.S. Department of Ed, that he promised to abolish. I told him everything, and I never got a response, and I know he got it because John Lofton, a journalist friend of mine, we called the White House, and Reagan's secretary said that he had it right on his desk. Yes, so anyway, yes, I am saying that Ronald Reagan was not what people thought he was. And he was the one that created the public-private partnerships. I was the liaison with the White House on that, for some reason, from the Department of Ed. And I went over there and I said, what are you doing here, merging the public and private sector? I said, isn't that corporate fascism? This is Reagan's project, by the way. And this lovely lady looked at me and said, oh, well, sure, I guess nobody ever looked at it that way. Well, that was when we lost our free economic system, right under Ronald Reagan. Started, the partnerships between the corporations and the government. Well, there had been plenty before then, but this is a basic change in our free market system under Ronald Reagan.
And do you think that might be why you get stonewalled in terms of having opportunities to be interviewed and talk about your work possibly because of your attitudes about Ronald Reagan?
My mouth shut on that. Some of my best friends, like Schlafly and Buchanan and all of them, they know how I feel. They know what I know. And they know what I know, too. What are they doing? Phyllis Schlafly, she was in Geneva when these agreements were signed with Gorbachev to merge the two education systems. She was there.
Wow. That's something else.
Well, the question is, you mentioned Pat Buchanan, another great. Okay, but what can they do? What can we do about all
what
this?
Can I do? You see, you've just rightfully said that I shouldn't. It would be better if I don't use these terms, and I agree with you, wouldn't it be? But I refuse not to, because this is my country, and I do not want my children living in a country where they can't go to church. Where they are totally taught with the Pavlov rat training Russian method, where they don't have a future as far as upward mobility, if they don't want to work too. Okay, it's a free country if you don't want to work. Where they are going to be totally controlled lifelong under this world system, and it is going to be lifelong. And let me point something out. People who wonder, where does all this curriculum come from? It comes from the UN. United Nations, by the way. Now, in 1962, I have a list of the directors of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization, right, where everything comes from that's going into American schools and schools all over the world. Out of 15 directors, there are only 15, 12 were Russian communists. 3 were one from Hungary, one from Poland, and one from France. Now, what does that tell you?
Yeah.
What?
Let me ask you a question. Just to really distill it down, just take a few seconds or maybe a minute and just outline what you think education should be about. In your opinion, what do you think education in a place like the United States of America should actually be?
Well, it should be K through 12. We should have a grading system, A, B, C, D, like we always used to have. We should have discipline, of course, in the schools, kind discipline. We should be teaching math, science, English, reading, history, art, languages, music, science, okay, like we used to do. We should be doing exactly what we used to do. It was a perfect system. We had the finest system in the world up until 1965, and it really hadn't changed that much by then because it took a lot of time for them to, the money that came in from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, most of it was used to experiment on the minorities, those programs that came in. And so that they seeped in, and I don't think they really started showing up because a lot of teachers resisted and superintendents resisted the change from being a teacher to being a little psychiatrist, right? And so it took a while for us to lose that wonderful label of the best in the world.
Well, how about in my particular case, when I was in elementary school, we're talking in the mid 60s. I didn't connect this for years later, but there was some psychiatrist counselor that had spoken with me and determined I needed to be put on Ritalin
Oh, absolutely. But if you go back, you'll find out that you probably heard of Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss is the head of the UN, right? Communist. But his good friend, Canadian psychiatrist, Brock Chisholm, in the late 40s, Chisholm and Hiss and all of them and all the psychiatrists got together and they decided that they were going to take over the schools. And Chisholm, he pointed out, he said very clearly that the teachers should become little psychiatrists. And he said we have got to get rid of the conscience because the whole goal there, I know people are really shaking their heads now, but the whole goal was to do away with war. You see, that's the UN. That's what they tell us, but they create every war we've ever had. But anyway, it was to do away with war, and the only way you could do away with war was to do away with a conscience, get rid of all of us, like myself and you and all of us, who say, hey, wait a minute, it's not fair to go over the border into Cambodia. That's not right. Stop it. Don't do it. We're going to go get you, buddy. And they got to get rid of that conscience. So what do? You use psychiatry. And the psychiatrists moved into the schools. Probably it started happening around the late 70s and early 80s. And that's when we got all these horrible values-changing programs, which, as I said to you earlier, I found out that the goal of those programs was to do exactly the opposite of what they told the parents and the school board those programs were designed to do.
Hey, Charlotte, we've only got a couple of minutes, and I want to take a phone call here. Let's go out to Riverside and talk to Larry. Larry, you're on the Many Moods.
Yeah, how you doing?
Good, good.
Hey, I was curious about something. I think the lady mentioned something about apprenticeships or job training.
Yeah, yes.
As opposed to college and universities and that kind of stuff.
No, I said opposed to teaching, the high school history, science, all those things. Yes.
Or you said something about from school to work kind of
school
thing?
to work, yes. And that agenda was set in place in the mid-'90s by President Bush Sr. It's in the congressional record. He called for apprenticeships for school to work is what we're talking about. And I've never had a problem with vocational ed. In fact, I love vocational ed. What we're talking about is taking the children at an earlier age and depriving them of a classical education and training them. And the old, C.S. Lewis, you've heard of him. He was the one who said, when training beats education, civilization dies.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you as far as the dumbing down of schools. It's a tragedy. Also, too, though, the job training, like the JTPA, you've heard of that?
Oh, yes, yes.
That was a total farce. The whole job training thing was a farce. I mean,
right.
They were pouring millions and millions of dollars, training these tens of thousands of people for jobs that weren't out there.
Right.
When the emphasis should have been on some kind of apprenticeship or on-the-job training kind of thing, and there was just no attention to that at all, and they're still doing it.
Hey, Larry, thank you so much for calling in here. Charlotte, we're up against the clock, but you're coming back with us again.
Okay, fine. Well, I've really enjoyed it, and, I don't know if enjoy is the word.
No.
What is the word?
Talking about this stuff, well, it's cathartic, I guess. I mean, they're validating to know that we go along with you, and so do our listeners. Hey, but thank you so much. The book is The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. It's coming out in an abridged version on November 15th. You can pre-order off my website, vincedaniels.com, and there's all the information there. Charlotte Iserbyt, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Vince and Cal, as well. I'll look forward to the next one.
Definitely. Look forward to it, Charlotte. Thanks.
Okay. And we're going to come back. Paul Andrews joins the show. That's right, our media mogul. We're going to go inside the tube, and we've got some prizes for you to win as well. So get ready to jump on the telephones. Toll-free 888-909-1050. It's 11:30 here on the Vince Daniels Show.